Now, what's the most dangerous place on Earth that you never want to visit? Maybe the Snake Island in Brazil? How about the Skeleton Coast in Namibia? We've managed to explore almost all of our planet's land, including all the inhospitable locations. And the North Pole made that list. So, what makes this place so perilous? Why would Santa Claus choose to make this place his headquarters? Why would Santa Claus choose to make this place his headquarters? Let's take a daring internet trip together, and I'll show you. A lot of Arctic expeditions have mysteriously ended in disasters. In the past, many ships got stuck on the ice, and people were stranded. Some ships have sunk and were never found. Not to mention that the Arctic Ocean underneath is still relatively unexplored. So, what's really going on here?
There is an invisible spot in the Northern Hemisphere that has captured the imagination of explorers and children for centuries. Invisible spot. No country owns it, although many covet it. It has no economic value. Its importance is strictly symbolic. Yet, for that reason alone, the North Pole is beyond price. Open for debate is who can claim to have been the first to stand at the top of the world, where all the lines of longitude converge. The controversy has never been settled. What is certain is that today, only a select few can sail to the North Pole aboard 50 years of victory.
What's really going on here? Before we dive deep into the middle of the Arctic ice, let me circle around the waters first. The North Pole is located in the middle of the Arctic Ocean and is covered in ice. The ice is approximately 6 to 10 feet deep, and it's floating in an ocean that's anywhere from 3,500 to 18,000 feet deep.
This is just a test run. It's quite late. I didn't really intend to make this video, but I was watching a documentary about Earth lines, and I wanted to follow the video by checking out Google Earth myself. So I downloaded Google Earth, and while I was playing around with it, I thought to myself, let me look at the globe. And while looking at the globe, I moved upwards, and noticed that without hitting any significant amount of ice, I was suddenly in Siberia over here. It's this area. So I wondered, where is the North Pole? And looking at this image here, the North Pole should be around here. If I correct the axis here, it's not the magnetical North Pole. Our North Pole should be somewhere around here. This is the most northern part of Earth, but I honestly do not see any ice there. And so I thought, okay, maybe there isn't ice there. Maybe what we consider the North Pole is just this part over here, which is Greenland. So I checked up some online resources on the North Pole and what is the North Pole, and it says here online about the North Pole that basically the North Pole is also known as the geographic North Pole or terrestrial North Pole, is defined as the point in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so that's the pole, right? But what about the icy area over there? So I tried to take a look at some images on the North Pole, and looking at these images here, some of them clearly show something different. Like, look at this, there's a whole bunch of ice. Or look at this here, or look at this one here, there's a whole bunch of ice. See, this is Greenland that we have here on our image, Greenland, Now the question is, where is all this ice? Now I know there have been climate summits recently, last year, and Iceland um, and Greenland. Uh, I know Iceland, they were asking people for help with the climate, to take care of their climate stuff, because the ice is melting over there. And I know Russia and America, many countries are diving into the resources over there, but that's something else. Um, my general question is if anybody knows whether the ice that we call North Pole, that huge floating chunk, has molten away, or or did Google Earth smudge it out, like in so many cases there have been claims that Google Earth just smudges out stuff and just takes it out. So I would wonder, why would the North Pole be taken out? Because if we go down here, we clearly see the South Pole is there. Okay, we see the South Pole. So we go back up again, all the way up here. There's no North Pole. And when it's really interesting. So if anybody can tell me about this, just leave me a comment. Maybe I'm using Google Earth wrong, or maybe there's no North Pole, because I just downloaded it now, so maybe I'm using it wrong. So yeah, just wanted to share this with you guys. Thank you so much. If you watched this to the end, respect. Thank you very much for your attention, and best wishes, peace, friendliness, love. Take care.
Hello guys. So when it comes to flat Earth, there are two things that are very interesting. The Arctic and Antarctica, also known as North Pole and the South Pole. Now most of you are familiar with Google Earth. It has been around for like 2005 I think, or maybe more or maybe less, I don't know. So usually when people play around and fool around with Google Earth, they like to, look at their cities, where they live, and familiar places. Now, not many people take their time to look at the North Pole or the South Pole. But if we do, let's do it. Okay, this is the South Pole. Now, activate the grid so you know exactly where it is. There it is. Okay. Now, if you really zoom in here and remove the grid, now this doesn't look like a normal image of anything. Now imagine this type of image over New York City or Manhattan. It would look really weird, ridiculous. It's like all these stripes here is smudged out and stretched out or stretched in towards this supposed center. There is nothing here. So this is absolutely photoshopped, and it's covered and hidden. I mean, just look at these mountains. Everything is smudged in or out, depending on how you see it. Well, anyways, so this isn't real. This can't be real. Okay, but that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is a discovery I made recently, and I'm not sure if you know about it or not. Anyways, as you can see, here is where the North Pole should be. But if you look here, there's this dark blue region in this ocean. Nothing is frozen, okay? So do you actually believe this is a real photo? No, it's the same with South Pole. This is not real, but they made a mistake. I don't know if it's deliberately or not. I don't know, but there is a little chance to see through this and discover at least a little portion of what could be hiding behind this photoshopped picture. So what you need to do is you need to go to Russia. Okay, this is Russia. This is North Russia, and as you can see, here is Alaska, and here is the border between the Bering Sound. Okay, and now I want you to pay attention to this island north of East Russia. Here it says the Long Strait. Okay, now pay attention to this island and look closely here, and you will see a stripe. And as you can see, the compass right here is pointing absolutely towards the north. So this stripe is going all the way to the North Pole. Now if you zoom in, you can see that there is ice. Okay, this whole light bluish thing is not even real. It's all photoshopped, it's all erased. Now what's funny about this strip is that it continues. You can actually see shapes here, you see? And so you just keep on going. I don't know if these are mountains. There are some dark portions here. As you can see, there are more layers here. Now look at that. What's funny is that this is going all the way to the North Pole. Okay? So you just keep going. Oh, look here. Even more, no, not more detailed, but as you can see, I don't even know if these are mountains. If these are in fact mountains, this is really serious, because if I zoom out, there is nothing there. Now, what comes here is a very dark portion. I don't know what it is. And here suddenly there are two stripes. Okay? Something that looks like mountains again, ice, clouds, anyways, whatever it is, it's not here on this dark blue. There's nothing here. Okay, so let's zoom out, and these stripes keep going. Now look at this very dark portion. Okay, ice, and nothing. Okay, and if we continue, there is ice again. Okay, and then here it stops. Let me take the grid back. It's pointing towards the North Pole. So as you can see, this doesn't add up. Okay, if you look here, this is a supposed mountain underwater they're showing, right? But here in the strip, it doesn't. Oh, this animated water is annoying. But you can go below the water if you like, and you can see this strip. So I'm underwater now, and you can see here that they're hiding a lot. They are really, really hiding a lot. Now, I wanted to show you this. You can look more and examine deeper into this strip. Maybe it will tell you something more, or you will find more clues about North Pole.
You see, unlike Antarctica, there's no land on the North Pole, which is why it's in constant motion. There's no land on the North Pole.
Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, the North Polar Arctic was imagined not as an uninhabitable sheet of ice as modern-day scientists and cartographers hold, but as a series of circular islands. The number of islands vary among these maps, although striking similarities can be seen, even on maps that were made thousands of miles away from one another. Did the map makers of the time simply copy and make additions to the popular maps which were false? Or perhaps, as I'm proposing, that this series of Arctic lands is not made up, but exists on our Earth. This region was subsequently deleted from future maps, and ever since, the common narrative is that the North Pole is a lifeless, uninhabitable stretch of ice.
Which is why it's in constant motion. But I'll get to that in a jiff. The fascinating thing is, even though the North Pole is literally ice, it's actually warmer than the South Pole. Now, don't get me wrong, they're both really cold because they don't get any direct sunlight. But there's more to that science.
Basically, you're doing this this path here, and this would be during the southern summer, right? And so it's a smaller arc, but you're also going faster, and yet you're supposed to cross the same amount of area in the same time that we do our summer, which is the longer path and the slower.
Wow.
So it makes absolutely no sense that you would sweep those, and then you have your spring and fall here. But yeah, I mean, this is much longer part of the ellipse, and we're going much slower, but yet they say you sweep equal area. That's, I think, Kepler's second law. I'm not sure which one, that you sweep.
Second law.
Yeah, equal area and equal time. So you have to do.
Well, and the reason that this becomes even more absurd is when you put the sun in motion as it is,
Right.
but it's not represented here. But when you put the sun in motion, you get these long sort of corkscrew patterns where half of it is necessarily going to be this very long arc representing the Earth traveling just a mind-boggling distance through space with the sun. And then the next part of that arc where the Earth's going in the opposite direction, essentially as that solar frame of reference, then you get these really tight parts of the corkscrew where hardly any distance is traversed because the sun's motion is doing a lot of that work. Right, you get the same thing with all orbital mechanics, like even with the moon. It's just a huge problem. But there's another one, and that's not even figuring in the fact that the sun's supposedly in motion in their model, which makes it just absurd.
Yeah,
So,
and
Jaron,
they had to make a choice. They had to choose what they were going to explain. So what they chose is to explain the motion of the sun in the sky that we observe by saying that the Earth is moving faster because it's closer in the southern hemisphere summertime.
so
But
but
to do
in that
that, it
model,
has to be closer. And if it's
Can I share
closer,
the screen, Bob?
Hang
After Rob?
on a second here.
Oh, yeah.
Continue.
oh,
Okay.
I'm almost through with the point.
That's
Just
okay.
that if it's closer, then that makes another reason that the continent of Antarctica should be a tropical destination for us.
right. That's what I was going to say, because when it's in that drawing that Jaron has there, the Earth would be tilting off to the top right, because we would be in wintertime. And
Here, you
so,
mean?
yeah,
Right.
when
Yeah,
we're
we're
in
just-
The axial tilt.
the axial tilt, the Earth would be pointing up to the upper right corner, such that that's why it's summertime in the so-called southern hemisphere. But you're right. I mean, how many million miles closer? It should be a tropical paradise.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
3 million miles closer, which I think is 300 Earth diameters. I'm not sure exactly.
And-
but
and
on
with-
top of that, you've got
With the
24 hour
inverse
sun.
square law.
Yeah,
too,
exactly.
It makes it they would be on fire.
Yeah.
Well,
and
it would
think
be
of that,
less than 1% of the entire one radius, though, or I mean less than 5% rather.
Yeah, less than 5%, but I think
So
that
so that diagram is a little bit skewed. I mean, not that you're going to get it perfect. I mean, I see that you're getting a point across, but just playing devil's advocate, you know, we're talking about a relatively small lopsidedness to it, right?
oh, you mean the entire track there, the ellipse or whatever?
Right. I mean, so 3 million miles closer is a lot of miles, but it's not a lot of 93 million miles.
No, but I mean, when
Yeah.
you think about 376 Earth diameters, yeah, you're right. It would be more like here. But I think the crazy part is you've got a frozen tundra down there that can't recover.
Oh
but
yeah,
yet,
it should be boiling, right?
yeah, it gets
Yeah.
24-hour sun. It's not like it's day and night there. During the summer, they're getting their summer, of course, they're getting 24 hours of sun, and that's why I've always questioned, people. You think it's a fake sun down there? I'm just saying that it's pretty weird that the sun is closer and is right there 24 hours a day, and yet it won't melt any of that ice. Well, what's the
Right.
reason for that?
Yeah, so like the whole globe Earth argument for the seasons is that the equator gets the most mean sunlight at the best angle. But according to that logic, I totally agree. I've thought about this for years, that during the summer, the southern hemisphere should just be absolutely boiling.
And I reject the premise of the axial tilt completely in its entirety to begin with.
Right.
Well, you could just
can't
place
have
it on.
something lay on. You can't have it spinning on an axis to the side and have it revolve around something else. Mechanically speaking, it will never happen. You can't demonstrate it in a lab or in any other way other than drawing pictures. Is the only way.
So what do? We just give that 23.5% to the 23.5 degrees to the sun? Is that how it's rectified? I mean, basically, then we're saying that the sun is on a orbital tilt or a plane inclined 23.5 degrees to the Earth. Is that how it would be corrected?
I don't know. Well, I don't know how they really ever explained it. It's just something I've seen my whole life, and it never sat well with me. And it's one of the euphoric things of dispensing with the whole model that they've created, was that ever since I was a child, that axial tilt, the revolving at an angle like that all the way around the sun, I reject that premise.
Well, they claim that the Earth is like a gyroscope, of course, but then of course on the other hand they'll say that it shouldn't generate any centrifugal force either. But so they get away with it by saying that it's behaving like a gyroscope, holds its rigidity in space. But in order to even begin to subscribe to any of that, you have to go with the assumption that the universe is an infinite vacuum. You have to go with the assumption of gravity. You have to go with the assumption that the Earth is a sphere as a base for all of that stuff. And frankly, none of that stuff exists in reality. And you're right, you can't demonstrate even something as simple as gravity in a lab. Mass does not attract mass, and yet everyone in scientific believes that it does for some reason.
Yeah. Well, and my point is, like, if you have an attractive force, then the heavier side of the sphere that's spinning is going to locate towards the sun. You're going to have it spinning at a different. You're going to have the axial tilt is going to match up with the axis of revolution. But the way they have it at 20, what was it, 23.5 degrees, and then it maintains and it goes around. They call it the wobble, and it's wobbling at 365.25 days every year, perfectly matched. And then they say, well, it's not perfectly matched. There's this axial precession that takes place over 26,000 years or something like that. Of course, it's such a long time frame that you can't observe that.
Well,
but
you should, though. You
I've
should.
rejected that premise,
Yeah, you should observe it, like especially with Polaris, because if you break down that 26,000 year precession, you get 1 degree every 72 years, half a degree over 36 years, quarter of a degree in 18 years. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're talking about our axial alignment in air quotes with Polaris, we shouldn't have the same North Star for more than a couple decades at the most.
Right.
And yet we've had Polaris for all of recorded history, and somehow all of astronomers overlook this. I don't get it.
Yeah.
So here's where it gets thought-provoking. Even though the South Pole is colder than the North Pole, it gets approximately 20,000 visitors per year. Whereas the North Pole only gets about 1,000, including expeditioners. So why is that? Well, let's find out together. To begin with, the North Pole has more complicated entry barriers. The main one is that it doesn't have a fixed location. It's just large chunks of ice that constantly move around the Arctic Ocean. The only way to visit the North Pole is via helicopter in April or an icebreaker ship in June and July. That's the only time of year that the ice is thin enough to be cut through by an icebreaker ship and move forward. Due to advancements in technology, a ship getting stuck on the ice is rare, but still very plausible. That's why there are only 5 trips every year to the North Pole. But those aren't the only issues.
Arriving destination 15, 6, 12, 10, 2. North Pole. Top of the world, guys. Top of the world. We'll get that in a minute, Jake. Oh, we're here. Arriving destination 15, 6, 12, 10, 2. North Pole. Top of the world, guys. Top of the world. We'll get that in a minute, Jake. 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 Oh, we're here. Top of the world. And the feeling's just indescribable. Absolutely indescribable.
Symbolic.
Absolutely indescribable.
Select few.
Absolutely indescribable. We'll get that in a minute, Jake. We'll get that in a minute, Jake. Unbelievable feeling.
My name is Jay Reister, Senior Mapping and Tech Support with Seiler Instrument. In this video, I will show how to unlock mock locations on an Android device.
We'll get that in a minute, Jake.
There's nobody higher than you on the top of the planet. I mean, 7 billion people below you now, Jake.
Unbelievable feeling. Just very difficult to put into words how it feels.
Make a great story.
1 centimetre of plastic coating off the end of our shoelaces.
We've walked to the top of the planet, the last degree up to the North Pole. 6 days of pulling our sledges weighing over 60 kilo. 6 days of 60 kilo.
That was it. Our expedition was over. We'd walked for a week in temperatures between -30 and -35 degrees to the North Pole. An incredible adventure, stunning scenery, great leadership from Alan, and just a wonderful experience.
We'll get that in a minute, Jake.
Make a great story.
But those aren't the only issues. Imagine you're walking in the woods and you get lost. Your best chance out there is a compass. But if you're in the North Pole, then you're in big trouble. While the compass is an ideal navigational tool, it doesn't exactly point north. The Earth's magnetic pole is The difference between the North Pole and the north indicated on a compass is an angle called declination. And since the Earth's magnetic field isn't uniform, the declination varies. According to the United States Geological Survey, at high latitudes, local disturbances in the North Pole can cause the compass needle to point away from the magnetic North Pole. Sometimes it can even point south. So, if you were lost in the North Pole, then using a compass to find your way out would be useless. Expeditioners use charts of declinations and calibrations to point themselves in the right direction. Speaking of not being able to find your way out of there, figuring out what time it is can also be an issue in the North Pole, because of the Earth's rotation.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution, and they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
well,
what they
if
found?
if the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one is going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
No, wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof to it.
Not that I'm surprised, Young.
The result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth.
Tell me what he
Heinrich
admitted.
Lorenz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's one of those things they're taught, but they've never actually used it.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Huh?
And you've never had issues, no matter where you're at, not calculating the Coriolis effect?
Never.
Huh?
But what they're completely failing to take into consideration is all the other motions that are in play here that are considerably faster.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened.
In fact, no experiment ever has shown that the Earth moves.
Huh?
Past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth.
Time is determined by the lines of longitude connecting the two poles. Since all the lines converge at the poles, this means that the North and South Pole are in all the time zones at the same time. South Pole are in all the time zones at the same time.
He documents it. You can watch him.
Turns out that the image was doctored by the Discovery Channel itself for a docu-fictional piece.
South Pole are in all the time zones at the same time.
Clearly, this shows us, if anything, that trickery is afoot. And this is not just one of the months. This is not just 2 of the months. It's not just 5 of the months. This is every month that they have a webcam video for. They have edited and cut out part of the day. And these are during the main months, which are January, December, and November, the southern summer. In this video, let's watch this green flag down below. You'll see it starting around maybe 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rotates around to about 2 o'clock, and then resets. Rotate around, reset. This is obviously a lie. This is obviously not what's going on. Why don't we get to see the sun do a 360-degree turn around the southern continent? Now remember, this would be pretty good evidence and proof of the globe, because it doesn't work on a flat earth to see the sun go around the southern continent. However, on a globe, it is something that should be really evident and should be seen in every single summer video from the South Pole. But again, watch the flag. It'll start around 8 o'clock, rotate around until it gets to 2, and then reset and start over. This should be a huge eye-opener. Should be something that screams to you fraud, fake, set up, contrived.
A docu-fictional piece.
So I emailed the head of the Australian Antarctic Division there, and she wrote back and basically said that the webcams at their Antarctic stations are subject to very limited internet connections, and frequent interruptions and dropouts are commonplace as the outages due to weather are extreme. Very slow bandwidth means we are unable to have constant streaming video. The time lapses you see on our site are stitched together from photos generated every 15 minutes, and basically saying that there'd be no way that they could have data from a whole entire day. Just taking a look at Mawson Station's current time lapse, for example, the images are being recorded overnight, and nothing appears to be missing. If you do notice anything absent on any of our webcams, please let us know the specifics so we can investigate any potential faults, or even maybe restore images where possible. So I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Why don't you have complete day's videos? You're cutting them yourself. So I wrote back, and she responded with, "Hi Jaron, I've spoken to our web manager, who was not available earlier. He let me know that some frames are actually missing by design. Because the webcams were set up so long ago, he had forgotten about a script he had written to omit frames that are mostly all black to save on space, bandwidth, and overall quality of the video. Chunks of time with just black screens are a bit of a waste," he said, "that if there is any reasonable light source in the image, then the image would not be omitted, and that the missing frames are based only on the amount of light in the image. That if there is any reasonable light source in the image, then the image would not be omitted, and that the missing frames are based only on the amount of light in the image. Thanks for your email. We will now add this to the FAQ for future webcam visitors." And if you can't tell, this is complete and total horseshit, because what we were just looking at was the summer months when there is no night. It's supposed to be 24 hours of sun going around. Why are those images omitted? So I said, "Jen, I still think you aren't quite understanding what I'm saying. If you have time-lapse webcam footage from the Amundsen Scott base, then why is there no 24-hour sun video? You guys have cut and edited every single video. Why? It makes no sense with your answers below about black screens. Please explain. For example, watch all videos for November, December, January, 2011, 2012, 2013. And the most recent email, which came earlier this week, said, "Hi Jaron, the Amundsen Scott Station is an American facility, and for all inquiries regarding their webcam footage, you need to contact them. The information and explanation that Jen provided below still applies to ours. Kind regards, Denise." So I have emailed all the people at the NOAA and the NSF, and we were waiting to see if they've got anything new to say besides just the same nonsense responses. So again, I've sped up this camera footage just a little bit to get you some more views of these time-lapse footages. but it's all much of the same. You'll see shadows going halfway around and then resetting. You can watch the time in every single video to see that never is a whole day played. Sometimes it actually appears that the shadow comes very close to doing some sort of a 360-degree turn, but regardless, you can look at the time and see that at minimum, 8 to 10 hours is cut out of every video. So how could the shadow even be coming close to doing a 360 if you're cutting out a third or more of the day? Again, this is good evidence here. If you watch the purple flag start out very long, then it gets short as it goes in front of you, and then becomes long as it resets and starts over. So as I said, even if you watch that little igloo on the left, it may look really close to a 360-degree turn, but by looking at the time, 10 hours are cut out of that day. That just tells me that these have been edited. So, these are not accurate portrayals of reality. Again, the biggest and most obvious point here is that if it was a globe that we live on, then what they are trying to show us would be 1, easy, 2, occurred daily, and 3, plainly evident. And it is none of those. It looks like they're trying to cut it up. It looks like they're trying to portray something that isn't actually happening. And it looks like they're trying to fool us. Let's pay attention to something here. Watch this shadow as it rotates towards the upper left of the screen, and notice that the shadow in this video coincides with the sun, not the opposite as would be required by, physics and optics. The shadow should be opposite of the sun, not rotating in tandem with it. Again, more evidence of extreme trickery, extreme editing. They're simply trying to sell us something that isn't reality.
A docu-fictional piece.
Granted, explorers choose the most convenient time zone for them. But if you're wondering what time it is at the North Pole now, well, it's basically whatever you want it to be. Now that we're done with all the science-y reasons that explain why it's difficult to make it to the North Pole, let's move on to the more practical explanations. One of the most important things is shelter. No one really lives in the North Pole. Even Inuit people who live in the surrounding Arctic regions of Russia, Greenland, and Canada have never made it their home. The ice is in constant motion, and it shrinks to half its size in the summer months. So nobody's ever tried to establish a community there, nor build any permanent man-made structures, because they'll either vanish or get destroyed. Even traveling around, it's possible to encounter an obstruction. Sometimes icebergs break off from glaciers in the Arctic Ocean and make it all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean. That's caused problems for a lot of ships taking transatlantic trips, and it's speculated that's exactly what happened with Titanic in 1912.
I truly believe that there's a lot more to this story, and from watching many archive videos, old footage of the Titanic and her sister ships, and looking at hundreds, possibly thousands of photographs, that I believe shows that the Titanic was switched, and the reason that she was switched is because of the financial gain of sinking the Olympic, which had been in several incidents, accidents and collisions over her years. But unfortunately, because of those accidents and collisions, she became uninsurable, and as such she was going to bring the White Star Line down and make them bankrupt, basically. So
these icebergs continue to be a hazard across the Atlantic. Even after the Titanic incident, there were hundreds of other collisions with icebergs. Fortunately, thanks to the International Ice Patrol, there haven't been any incidents recently, but it's still a serious issue. Now that we're on the topic of icebergs, here's another interesting fact. There's no drinkable water at the North Pole. Early Arctic explorers had a hard time dealing with thirst. In fact, finding water in the Arctic is as difficult as finding water in the desert. There's no drinkable water at the North Pole.
UK scientists have detected a huge dome of fresh water that is developing in the western Arctic Ocean. The bulge is some 8,000 cubic kilometers in size and has risen by about 15 centimeters since 2002.
The salt water is impossible to drink, and people's only means of staying hydrated was eating snow. But that was dangerous too, because that could lead to hypothermia. So they had to melt it. But back then, they didn't have any convenient heating methods to turn ice into water, so many explorers didn't make it. The most dangerous issue of them all is the global warming and ice melting. Scientists now believe that in 50 years there will be no ice in the North Pole during the summer.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. This video is about Arctic fake news. Every day we see stories in the press about Arctic sea ice disappearing, record heat in the Arctic, Greenland melting down, we're all going to drown, multi-year sea ice disappearing. Are any of these stories true? Let's look at the data and find out for ourselves. This is the current Arctic sea ice extent graph from the Danish Meteorological Institute. If we zoom in on it, we can see a lot more detail. The red dot represents current sea ice extent. The three lines below it represent sea ice extent in the past 3 years, 2014, 2015, and 2016. We can see that sea ice extent is higher than it's been in any of the past 3 years. Sea ice extent is also just below 2013, shown in blue, and not far below the 1981 to 2000 mean, shown in dark gray here. It's also within the 2 standard deviation light gray bands, which means that Arctic sea ice extent is normal. So perhaps climate alarmists don't trust the Danish Meteorological Institute for some reason.
Oh, and about Santa Claus and the North Pole headquarters? Well, think about it. If you wanted some privacy without distractions to get your work done, wouldn't this sound like the right place? And if he should ever run out of supplies, there's a Walmart nearby. Well, not really. So, what do you guys think about the North Pole? Would it be a place you'd like to visit in the next 50 years? Let me know down in the comments. If you learned something new today, then give this video a like and share it with a friend.
While I was researching information on the Jinn, I discovered a lot of the mythology around Mount Qaf. And Mount Qaf in Arabic tradition is a mysterious mountain, renowned as the farthest point of the earth, owing to its location on the far side of the ocean encircling the earth. Because of its remoteness, the North Pole has been identified as the location of this mountain. It is also called the only place in the world where the rock will land. Now, Mount Qaf is also unique in the sense that it's believed to be the home of the Jinn, or tribes of Jinn. And there's quite a rich description used to describe the world of the Jinn that lies on Mount Qaf and beyond, including great emerald mountains and cities where is a perpetual twilight. It describes essentially a folkloric cosmology, and it's this cosmology that led me to explore this particular concept in a little bit deeper. This idea of the axis of the world, or the sacred mountain, and that led me to the idea of Rupus Nigra, or the myth of it rather. So Rupus Nigra, or which means black rock, is a phantom island, and it's believed to be this giant black mountain located at the magnetic North Pole, or it is the North Pole itself. So the rationale was all compasses pointed to this area, so it must be a magnetic island. So it's a similar myth to the Persian and Arab myth of Mount Qaf. But one interesting thing about it is there's a particular book associated with Rupus Nigra which identified the island itself, the island mountain rather, and it led to this mountain being in maps up to the 17th century. So the idea came from a lost book called Inventio Fortunata, and the island featured on maps from the 16th to 17th centuries, including those of Geraldus Mercator and his successors. And Mercator described the island in 1577 in a letter to Dr. John Dee. In the midst of the four countries is a whirlpool, into which there empty these four indrawing seas which divide the north, and the water rushes about and descends into the earth, just as if one were pouring it through a filter funnel. It is 4 degrees wide on every side of the pole, that is to say 8 degrees altogether, except that right under the pole is where there lies bare a rock in the midst of the sea. Its circumference is almost 33 French miles, and it is all of magnetic stone. This is word for word everything that I have copied out of this author. And the author he's referring to is Jacobus Knoyden. It's quite interesting there that he's writing to John Dee. And anybody who's studied magic or the occult in any degree should be aware of who John Dee is. So this particular myth takes an interesting turn. Here we see Mercator's map of the Arctic, and what it shows here is Rupus Nigrae and the 4 islands around it. So it's referred to as the Pole Arcticus, which is clearly the North Pole of this island. So nothing is known of this particular island. There's nothing clear about it, yet it appeared in all these maps. So the lost book itself, Inventio Fortunata, it's assumed to be dating from the 14th century, and it contains this description of the North Pole as the magnetic island. So no direct extracts from the document have ever been discovered, but its influence on the Western idea of geography and the Arctic region persisted for several centuries. The book is said to be a travelogue written by a 14th century Franciscan friar from Oxford who travelled the North Atlantic region in the early 1360s, making some half a dozen journeys conducting business on behalf of the King of England, and that at the time was Edward III. He described what he's found on his first journey to the islands beyond the 54 degrees north in a book, Inventio Fortunata, which he then presented to the king. Unfortunately, by the time Arctic explorers were seeking information in the 1490s, the Inventio had gone missing, and was only known through a summary in a second text, Itinerarium, written by a traveller named Jacobus Knoyden, and Knoyden's summary was the basis for the depiction of the Arctic region on many maps, the earliest being Martin Boheim's 1492 globe, and by the late 16th century even Knoyden's text was missing, so most of what we know about the contents of Inventio Fortunata, other than its use on maps, is found later in a letter from the Flemish cartographer Mercator to John Dee, which we mentioned. And that letter is now located in the British Museum. So Knoyden's information came in a very roundabout way. A priest from one of the Atlantic islands had returned to Norway and bringing with him an astrolabe which he received from a visiting Franciscan friar in exchange for a religious book. He made a detailed report to the King of Norway. Copies still survive of a social and geographical description of Greenland by a local church official named Ivar Bardason, who turns up in Norwegian records in 1364. So much of Knoyden's story tallies well with reality, although this report does not contain the sort of personal information relayed by Knoyden. Knoyden seems to have obtained his information from Norwegian sources sometime later. Neither he nor the priest haven't actually seen the Inventio. Knoyden's account, originally in his own language, translations that I'm about to read are based on Eva Taylor's version. Knoyden's account mixes probable fact with what may have been his own attempts to research the background, stating that Greenland was first settled at the orders of King Arthur, whose army supposedly conquered the North Atlantic islands. He also referred to the indrawing seas currents which drew ships northward, so that, and this is the quotation, nearly 4,000 persons entered the indrawing seas who never returned. But in AD 1364, 8 of these people came to the king's court in Norway. Among them were 2 priests, one of them whom had an astrolabe, was descended in the 5th generation from a Brussels citizen. One, I say, all 8 were from those who had penetrated the northern regions in the first ships. And that's quite interesting. The indrawn sea and some of the references here seem to kind of help support some of the ideas around that area having an entrance into the inner earth. A particular theory which I which I do deeply enjoy reading about. So as I said, the influence on maps was massive. Where this led me to as well was thinking about, well, the idea of the sacred map in cosmology and the sacred region in cosmology, because essentially Mount Qaf is seen as the borders of the world and a mountain range that supports the sky. And Rupes Negre has this idea of it being some sort of entrance or exit from this world. There's something of mystery and magic about it, where the laws of nature seem to change, the inbound sea, the magnetic draw to the place. And off the back of that, I did a bit more research, and I came across a guy called Chet van Duzer, and he has written extensively about maps and their place in history, and it's some really, really interesting work. If you have a chance to have a look at some of his work on Amazon, it's really interesting books about cartography and the idea of like sea monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps. And I'm going to read some extracts of his work, The Mythic Geography of the Northern Polar Regions, Inventio Fortunata, and Buddhist Cosmology. Sacred centers are usually located near the people in whose mythology they play a part. But there are distant spots on the earth that many different peoples recognize have a special central status, the North and South Poles. These spots are pierced by the axis of the heavens. They are the crowns of the world, about which all the stars dance, the points to which all compasses direct their needles. The recognition of the centrality of the Earth's poles is reflected in one of the names of the sacred centers, Axis Mundi, as well as in various attempts to connect sacred centers with the poles. The city of Beijing is known as the pivot of the four quarters, and the sacred center of the city, the Forbidden City, is more precisely known as the Purple Forbidden City. Purple being the symbolic color of the North Star, and the designation Purple Forbidden City thus signifying that the Emperor's residence is at the center of the world. There was also a 9th century Islamic tradition argued by Al-Qisa of Kufa that the Kaaba in Mecca, for which the center of the earth is a common epithet among Muslims, is located directly beneath the North Star. Thus symbolism of or connection with the pole is often ascribed to local sacred centers, while the pole itself, until this century, both in belief and in fact unattainable, has received little mythological attention as a center. I will examine two systems of mythology relating to the northern polar regions, systems which, true from very different cultures, turn out to be remarkably similar. Geraldus Mercator is perhaps the only figure in history of cartography whose name has become a household word, and his system of map projection, called the Mercator projection, is still widely used today, albeit usually in slightly modified forms. Mercator was famous for his meticulous research and accuracy, and thus it is quite surprised to see for the first time Mercator's map of the northern polar regions. I'm not going to be able to pronounce the map as its title is in Latin, but it was published in 1595. And on this map, you'll see the North Pole is very unfamiliar to modern eyes, as we mentioned this before. At the center of the map, right at the pole, stands a huge black mountain. This mountain is made of lodestone, the magnetic stone, and is the source of the Earth's magnetic field. The central mountain is surrounded by open water, and then further out by 4 large islands that form a ring around the pole. The largest of these islands, perhaps 700 by 1,100 miles, and they all have high mountains along their southern rims. These islands are separated by 4 large inward flowing seas, which are aligned as if to the 4 points of the compass. Though, of course, there is no north, east, or west of the North Pole, every direction from its center is south. Mercator notes inform us that the waters of these oceans carried northward to the pole, and through these rivers with great force, such as no wind could make a ship sail against the current. The waters then disappear into an enormous whirlpool beneath the mountain at the pole and are absorbed into the bowels of the earth. Mercator also tells us that a 4-foot tall pygmies inhabit the island closest to Europe. More remarkable than the map itself is the fact that many other contemporary maps by the most respected cartographers of the time, show a very similar configuration around the North Pole. Martin Behaim, who died before Mercator was born, made a famous globe in 1492. This is in fact the oldest surviving terrestrial globe. That shows land surrounding the North Pole. There are two large islands right near the pole and in the Western Hemisphere, while extensions of Europe and Asia reach northwards so as to form, together with the two islands just mentioned, a broken circle of land around the pole. A world map by Johannes Ruysch, the Universa Cognitis Orbis Tabula, published in an edition of Ptolemy's Geographia in Rome 1508, shows 4 islands around the North Pole. 2, the one north of Greenland and opposite across the pole, are labelled Insula Deserta, and the one north of Europe is that of the Hyperboreans, and the one north of America is labelled Aronfi. He labels the waters within the 4 islands as the Mare Suginum, and speaks of a violent whirlpool that sucks the incoming waters down into the earth. In addition, his map shows a ring of small, very mountainous islands around the 4 islands, which numerous islands, Ruysch says, are uninhabited. So you can see we start to form a mystic cosmology that existed up into the 17th century. There's the land of the Hyperboreans. There's a ring of uninhabited mountainous islands and a treacherous whirlpool and an absolutely violent sea surround this area. So it's kind of an otherworld, almost kind of land of the dead, where human beings can't possibly exist. And that makes a good kind of liminal step into other worlds. This place where all things within the earth are drawn into and beneath. The magnetic force that points there, all compasses point there. And then the tempestuous, terrible waters, that surrounded, protected, and prevented human beings from passing through, or indeed getting back, as in the aforementioned disastrous trip in Croydon's account earlier, where 4,000 persons entered the indrawing sea but never returned. So from this first globe, published in 1492, right up to the 1700s, this configuration of islands around the pole featured in literally scores of maps. So the suggestion that there must be a large mountain of lodestone at the North Pole to account for the Earth's magnetism goes back at least to the 13th century, not long after the invention of the compass. But what was the source of the 4 islands and the inward flowing rivers, of the mountains and the pygmies? Mercator cites his authority for the delineation of the northern regions in the itinerarium of the Flemish traveller Jacobus Noiden, which, as we said already, is a lost, that summary no longer exists. Coyden gave his sources, the Res Gestae Arturi Britanni, also lost. This is a book written by an English Minorite, a mathematician from Oxford, who had travelled far north in 1360 and recorded what he saw. And this work was called the Inventio Fortunata. So this is the source that Coyden's cites. Also, Mercator and his contemporaries believed the author of the Inventio Fortunata, the English Minorite, the friar, to be Nicholas de Lina, Nicholas of King Lynn. Others have argued against this identification. Thus, the source of the mythical polar geography is a lost work by an unknown author in the 14th century. Nonetheless, it is possible to speculate about where the author of the Inventio Fortunata may have derived this geography. Nansen has found mentions of a great northern whirlpool in Norse legends of the world's well, the Hurfgelmir, which caused the tides by pushing and pulling water through its subterranean channels. The Topographica Hypernica by Geraldus Cambrenus in 1146 to 1220, his description of the northern whirlpool is cited by Mercator, and the Historie Norvega 1180 and the Speculum Regale 1250 of Einar Gunnarsson, and particularly interesting quote from the Langobard author Paulus Warren Friddy, 720 to 790, also called Diaconus. And this is the quote. And not far from the shore which we before spoke of, on the west, where the ocean extends without bounds, is that very deep abyss of waters which we commonly call the ocean's navel. It is said twice a day to suck the waves into itself and to spew them out again, as is proved to happen along all these coasts, where the waves rush in and go back in again with fearful rapidity. By the whirlpool of which we have spoken, it is asserted that ships are often drawn in with such rapidity that they seem to resemble a flight of arrows through the air, and sometimes they are lost in the gulf with a frightful destruction. Often, just as they are about to go under, they are brought back again by a sudden shock of the waves, and they are sent out again hence with the same rapidity with which they were drawn in. The persistence of the Inventio Fortunata geography on maps, say for 150 years, is to some extent a testament to the esteem in which Mercator and Ortelius were held by other cartographers. The Inventio Fortunata places a mountain at the pole, and of course many sacred centres are mountains. A passage into the depths of the earth is another common feature of sacred centres. Moreover, the powerful flow of water from the four corners of the earth in through the rivers to the pole and there down a whirlpool is the strongest possible confirmation and emphasis of the pole's centrality, as strong almost as the thought of 1 million Muslims facing Mecca from all corners of the earth 5 times a day in prayer. This role the North Pole plays in circulation of the earth's waters gives the spot the global importance we expect of a sacred centre. Also, a number of sacred centres seem to be connected with primal waters. The Garden of Eden again, the rock of the Temple of Jerusalem, which closes the mouth of the Thahom, the watery chaos beneath the earth that was involved in Noah's flood, Uisneach Hill in Ireland, the seat of the Stone of Divisions, and the centre of Ireland according to the division of the country made by the god Fitnan, son of Ocean, who was also the source of the waters of the deluge, and the mountain Harati, or Alborz, to the east of Iran, which is the navel of waters, as the fountain of all water springs here. Thus, the surprisingly long survival of the Inventio Fortunata geography reflects the mythological power of that geography. It asserted a polar configuration consistent with people's expectation for one of the 2 spots on the planet pierced by the celestial axis. The other example of northern polar mythology I would like to examine is the Brahmic, Hindu, and Buddhist conception of the earth. Brahmic, Hindu, and Buddhist mythology is very complex, partly because of the creativity of Indian mythographers, which results in many different versions of each myth, partly because Indian mythographers rarely abandon old ideas and theories and just continue to present them as alongside new ideas, even when the new and old were inconsistent. The complexity may increase even further when one cosmological scheme, for instance, is presented not merely alongside another, but encapsulated within another. In Brahmic, Hindu, and Buddhist belief, the Earth's sacred center is, quite unusually, not near at hand, but far off to the north on a separate, unattainable continent. The center of it is Mount Meru, or Sumeru, or Sinuru, and it is the axis mundi, the fixed point about which the heavens revolve. Its summit is the dwelling place of the Trimasa gods, the highest of the 6 Buddhist world of gods. According to the 4-continent Earth model, the Earth's continents are arranged in the form of a lotus flower. Mount Meru stands at the center of the world, the periscarp, or the seed vessel of the flower, as it were, surrounded by circular ranges of mountains. Around Mount Meru, the petals of the lotus are arranged in 4 island continents, aligned to the 4 points of the compasses. Sounds pretty familiar. Uttarakuru to the north, Ketumala and Aparagoyana to the west, Bhadrasa and Puvidya to the east, and Bharata and Jambuita to the south. Jambuita is part of the world inhabited by humans. The dimensions for all these elements are fantastic. Mount Meru is 84,000 yohanas, or 420,000 miles high. The island continent of Jambudvipa, which includes India, is 10,000 yohanas, 50,000 miles in extent, with an area occupied by the Himalayan range and human habitations being 3,000 yohanas, 15,000 miles in extent. The level of detail and descriptions of all these mythical regions is astonishing. There are named mountain ranges, rivers, races of semi-divine beings everywhere, and we learn the height of each of the race, how long they lived, the shape of their faces. In addition, it was held that on or near Mount Nemrut was Lake Anotata, or Anotwat, which was the source of the world's rivers. The lake is surrounded by a mountainous rim, and through rocky openings in this rim, shaped like the heads of an ox, horse, lion, and elephant, 4 rivers flow south, east, north, and west respectively. These rivers flow 3 times around Anotata in spirals, and then continue in their original direction towards the 4 cardinal points. The river flowing to the south from the ox's head is the Proto-Ganges. After dashing against a mountain spurting high, 60 yohanas or 300 miles into the air, falling back to the earth and following an underground course, it emerges to form 5 rivers whose names can be traced to the rivers of northern India, namely the Ganges and its tributaries. Mount Meru is at the point about which the heavens revolve, the axis mundi, and thus something very similar to the North Pole of the Buddhist and Hindu universe. Indeed, the North Star was held to stand directly above Mount Meru, linked by ropes of wind to all the heavenly bodies. The similarities between Inventio Fortunata and the Brahmic, Hindu, and Buddhist concepts of the northern polar regions of the Earth should by now be obvious. Both place a large mountain at the pole, surrounded by 4 islands, aligned as if to the 4 points of the compass. From one mountain radiates the Earth's magnetic field, the other is the pivot of the universe, the home of the divine, and while the Inventio Fortunata has the waters of the world's oceans flowing in towards the pole from the 4 quarters and down into the earth, the Buddhist conception has a large lake with 4 huge rivers flowing out to the 4 corners of the earth. Of course, there are many differences between the 2 conceptions. The one is secular or geographical mythology, the other divine, and there are differences of scale, differences in degree of elaboration, the difference between the water flowing in and the water flowing out, and others. But the similarities are impressive. To attempt to argue that the Inventio Fortunato was by some circuitous means derived from a Buddhist conceptions of the northern polar regions would be at best a highly precarious undertaking. Quite aside from the inherent improbability of such an influence, when the work itself is lost and its author is uncertain, no such argument can have a foot to stand on. I am inclined rather to see the fact that 2 or so similar mythographies of the northern polar regions should arise and persist in 2 so different cultures as a testament to the creativity of these 2 cultures, and to the degree to which these mythologies match our innate transcultural conception of what a sacred center should be. So that's the end of that article, with my apologies for my impromptu commentary midway. So again, the author is Chet Van Duzer, and he's got some very interesting books that are worth checking out on Amazon. I suppose the final commentary from me, I find it really interesting that there's the cosmology lacking from Mr. Duzer's essay is Mount Quef, which is also based in the North Pole, as I mentioned at the start of this video. I find that really intriguing. So you've ended up with Brahmic, Hindu, Buddhist, the Christian world's view of the North, and then you have an Islamic myth as well. And I do think there's some interconnectivity there, that perhaps the root of these ideas have a common source, but that's utter conjecture. The relationship to the 4 cardinal points, the relationship to water, the idea that there is this enormous mountain there, and the idea that this is a place of liminality, that it is a crossroads between our world and another, either the interior or of the world or the divine, makes it a very special place, be that one solely existing in myth. It's a really interesting concept to look at. And there still is some mythology. There still is some mythology around the North Pole. We still have our own modern myths. You know, obviously the obvious one is, of course, that it is the home of Santa Claus. You know, our Yuletide king, a mythical being that lives in the north and that is capable of traversing the world in one night. That's a big myth, but beyond that, there's also kind of the modern, more conspiratorial myths where it is an international agreement that does not allow for flights across or over the North Pole. That there is no aerial photography of the North Pole, there's no satellite photography of the North Pole. And this kind of supports the whole idea that there is an entrance to an inner Earth there. I'm not saying there is or not, as I obviously never commit to anything, but I do like the idea of it. It is an intriguing, thing, and certainly whenever I see anything about the inner Earth, I want to read more. I want to find out more. Is there an entrance to Agartha?
If these are in fact mountains, this is really serious, because if I zoom out, there is nothing there. Now, what comes here is a very, very dark portion. I don't know what it is.
All of the cultures of the world, and they're present, and he presents all of these stories in his appeal that the North Pole had once been the foundation for, and it was the mother culture, the civilization for all the peoples of the world. And that even the stories of Atlantis, as I said, Asgard, Shambhala, Hyperborea, Thule, all of these ancient places which are attributed as having been inhabited by the ancient peoples, the demigodic, those that were part angelic and also part earthly, that these heroes, these men of renown, as our Bible speaks about in Genesis chapter 6, that there was a group of these fallen angelic rebel angel type beings that had lived in this particular location prior to it having become iced over, or that there's a portion of the extreme polar north that may be indwelling in the interior of the earth, and that there is also specified in the ancient accounts a hole, a vortex which leads into the interior of the earth. And it's interesting that the mythologies and also the biblical narrative, according to individuals like Enoch and Job, they describe these vortex openings, and that hell, it remains naked, is exposed in this particular region, in this portion of the world. And there's also said to be what is described, and the reason I read Isaiah 14 is its reference to the Mount of the Congregation. That when we examine this passage as asserted by Lucifer or Hallel, however you want to take and interpret that particular passage, where it speaks about, for thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, that it is only at the North Pole that this vortex exists. And in my new book, I write about how this particular area, this is where Jacob's ladder is, and that there is a way to ascend not only up into the heavens, and that anytime a prophet or a patriarch or a man or woman of knowledge and wisdom is taken up to the heavens, that it is to this sides of the north that they are taken, because this is the only place which this vortex and this opening is to be found. And so all of them are taken up into the heavens in similar manner. And notice also that where Lucifer says, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. That he is in this reference speaking about how the luminaries being placed within the firmament of our world, the vaulted dome of the earth, that directly above Polaris we have established the throne room and the heavenly temple of the Most High God. And that the reason we see all of the stars, the heavenly luminaries and the celestial hosts, moving in circle around Polaris, and Polaris being fixed, unmoving, immobile, is because it as star is indicative of the center of the vaulted dome. And that when the dome comes to union, that all of the walls, beginning where they merge with the ends of the earth, the circle of the earth, that all of them rise in apex towards the north. Because no matter where you are in a circle, you're at these southern limits, these southern extremes, and then moving north, no matter which portion of a circle you are on as far as the outer edge, in moving north, you're going to come to what is referenced here as these sides of the north, and that these sides of the north meet in union right above Polaris. And Polaris, as I said, is indicative of the very center of the firmament as it was established by the Most High God in being spread. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, the Most High God who sits upon the circle of the earth and has spread the heavenly curtain as a tent or tabernacle above it. And so this passage, as cryptic as it is, once understood, helps you to understand not only the real cosmology, but also that the Most High God indeed has established his throne above the sides of the north and upon the Mount of the Congregation. And this Mount of the Congregation, interestingly enough, when you study the Vedic cosmology and all the cosmologies of the world, the Greek mythologies, the other mythologies, that you always find reference to places like Mount Meru, which is the Vedic cosmology. And it is described as being a cone-shaped mountain, which taller than any other mountain in the world, is located directly in the middle of the circle of the earth. And that from there it rises up into heaven more so than any other mountain in the world. And that it's taller than even that of Mount Everest. And that this particular mountain is also called Mount Olympus in the Greek mythology. And it describes how the demigods, that they live there upon, and that from there they look down upon the earth and the interactions, the happenings, the occurrences, which the world of humanity, that this is also cited in Job chapter 1, where it speaks about Satan coming along with the other sons of God to meet with the Most High God, the Council of the Mighty, the divine congregation, that this is the Mount of the congregation as spoken about in this passage. There's so many stories throughout the ancient mythologies of these places that lie in the interior of the earth, or that lie in places which are not visible to us. Whether it's dimensionality that we're not able to access or to see these particular places, or there being how should I say? They're just being outside of access to humans, normal humans in this world. And there's also another story. It's called The History of the Rechabites. And in this particular story, The History of the Rechabites, it speaks about how God, a long time ago, had taken a particular people and separated them because they were righteous, and separated them from the people of this world and placed them upon a island paradise and allowed them to live there until the end of days. And that these people, I believe they lived as if Adam and Eve had in paradise, where they were naked and yet unashamed, and that they basically, going back to the innocence of our former estate, and that they were protected, and that only those that were righteous, or like for instance in this story, one of these prophets of the Most High God, and fasting and desiring and wanting to know and learn about these people, and hear about their stories, was allowed access to their community. Much like the story of the Smoky God, these two Norwegian fishermen in heading north and overcoming many difficulties, that in the story it is said that they made it into the interior of the earth, and that they there met a group of benevolent giant beings, and that these giants took them in, and that they had very high technology, and that the world that they lived upon or lived within, that this world was of massive portion, and that it resembled what would have been the antediluvian world, where we see in the archaeological record, in the geological record, dragonflies as wide with a wingspan of 6 feet across, and that all of the plants and the creatures were of gigantic proportion, massive size in comparison to what we see with regard to humanity and the creatures of today. And that even in the biblical account of the stories of Adam and Eve, as Kathy and I brought forth in a show that we did, the antediluvian trees and giants and mankind, where we talked about how in the Gospel of Bartholomew, it describes Adam as having once been 80 feet tall, and Eve as having once been 50 feet tall. Now, whether that is correct or not, or if there's anything to that, we certainly know that they had larger stature and lived longer lifespans previous to the flood of Noah's day. Speaking about just the difference, as far as the different mythologies and how in the world, and also in the chat room, Walking in Truth was mentioning how he had read, or he or she, I'm not sure, had read Admiral Byrd's diary, and that the diary spoke about, had a lot of really interesting and fascinating stuff within it, and that it spoke about how Admiral Byrd had even met these very advanced beings within the interior of the earth. And so this is all tied to and connected to those particular things. And so I want to bring up to you just some of the ancient accounts and a description of this hollow interior and how it is said in all of these different traditions that not only are giants said to be residing there within, but also these what are referenced as the Nagas, which in the Vedic cosmology is an ancient reptilian race of beings, a type of serpent people, and that there are other stories of these dragon lineages that even in China, South America, and Mexico, and other portions of the world, Japan, there are stories of the ancient royal families that are still in power in many of these portions of the world, that these particular lines had been formed through the union of one of these seraphic peoples, which we know the seraphim angels are also these dragon-like entities, what is referenced in Genesis as the Nakash, that these particular beings seated in very ancient times, that they intermarried themselves to and involved themselves genetically with not only pre-Adamic races, but that they also bred into the line of Cain. And so that's what we're contending with. The whole thing of, Adam and Eve being placed into the flesh and given opportunity to live in this world in flesh form, that same privilege, which it's a privilege and a curse at the same time, that same courtesy was extended to all of us, and that this is why we see humanity, that we are all now being born into this world. All right, so I wanted to talk about a little bit more about the vortex and the opening and the coming together. But I want to share with you, before I do so, an article that was released, that was put out in 2006. It says the Russian scientist finds paradise at the North Pole, and this was November 29th of 2006. And this will give you a little bit more of an understanding of what I have been alluding to with regard to the mythology. And then I'll go further into this with some biblical passages and then a description of how this is also tied to the end of days, because in Joel chapter 2, it speaks about that there would be a supernatural release of what is called the Locust Army. It says, the following article will set up precisely discussion on the topography and the landscape which lies at the northern regions, according to those explorers rumored to have survived journey there. Over the next few chapters, I will elaborate upon the testimonies while also in a later portion reference some of the mythology connected to these regions. Valery Diamond, a researcher of the Arctic region, maintains that Hyperborea, meaning beyond the Boreas or the north wind, a mythical land that the Greeks thought was located beyond Scythia, existed in reality. The legendary French scientist Jean-Sylvain Bailly attempted to prove the existence of Hyperborea a few centuries ago. Question, and this is an interview, so it's a question and answer session. Could you name any other scientists who also made a lot of effort trying to shed some light on the mystery of Hyperborea? Yes, there were many of them. Not only the geographers and historians worked on the problem, the linguists also made several contributions. The rector of the University of Boston, William Warren, remember I told you about this Pastor William Warren, published a book titled Paradise Found at the North Pole in the late 19th century. In total, there were 11 editions of the book. Warren analyzed a large number of spoken stories and legends relating to paradise on earth, or Eden. According to him, all the information contained therein stems from vague recollections of some ancient perfect land that lay somewhere in the Arctic region. I believe we should be looking for the traces of that civilization in Eurasia and American Arctic regions. The islands and archipelagos of the Arctic Oceans at the bottom of some seas, lakes, and rivers. It's worthy of notice that the Russia has the largest number of locations and artifacts that could bear relevance to Hyperborea. Some of the above have already drawn attention of specialists. Others are yet to be discovered. Active explorations is currently underway in the Kola Peninsula in the island of Vygach, in Karelia, the Ural Mountains, West Siberia, Caucasia, Yakutia, and a few other regions. There are good prospects for conducting research in Franz Josef Land, Taimyr, and Yamal. The geographic term Hyperborean platform is technical use. Scientists keep discussing the platform dynamics in order to find out the reasons why it sank to the bottom of the ocean. Let me make a comment here that we discover at the bottoms of lakes, oceans, and seas remnants of this ancient culture, this ancient civilization, and that the placement of these structures, these megalithic cyclopean structures, at the bottoms of these particular regions of the world, the oceans and lakes and others, the seas, means that they had to have been built at a time when that land was either elevated above sea level or that the oceans had not yet risen to the levels that we see them occupying today. And I actually believe that it's a little bit of both. In other words, Hyperborea may have stretched over the lands that eventually sank into the water, question mark. One of the charts by Gerardus Mercator, the 16th century Flemish cartographer and geographer, shows a huge continent lying in the vicinity of the North Pole. The land is an archipelago composed of several islands divided by deep rivers. A mountain sits in the center of the land. According to legends, the ancestors of Indo-Europeans lived near Mount Meru. The question is, how did that land appear on the chart? There was no information whatsoever regarding the Arctic regions during the Middle Ages. We have some reasons to believe that Mercator had used an ancient chart, the one that is mentioned in his letter dated 1580. All right, we'll be right back, everyone. With regard, I'm going to go back to this particular story that I was reading because it ties into even what Admiral Byrd had spoken about supposedly in his secret diary, and also that the the two Norwegian fishermen that the story of the Smoky God is about them, and it gets its title, the Smoky God, from what is said to be a sun-like that there's a force or a light of something that is similar to our sun within the interior of the earth, and it is referenced as the smoky god, and it is celebrated and honored and worshipped and revered by the people that are inhabiting the interiors of the earth, according to the story. And so that's that's where they get the whole the reference to the smoky god. It's supposed to be some kind of sun-like body on the interior of the earth. And so, anyways, back to the charts of Mercator. One of the charts of Gerardus Mercator, the 16th century Flemish cartographer and geographer, shows a huge continent lying in the vicinity of the North Pole. The land is an archipelago composed of several islands divided by deep rivers. A mountain sits in the center of the land. According to the legends, the ancestors of the Indo-Europeans lived near Mount Meru. The question is, how did that land appear on the chart? There was no information whatsoever regarding the Arctic regions during the Middle Ages. We have some reason to believe that Mercator had used an ancient chart, the one that is mentioned in his letter dated 1580. That chart showed a continent located in the center of the Arctic Ocean, which was pictured ice-free on the chart. Mercator's chart seems to be based on this particular ancient chart. Now, I want to make mention that Admiral Byrd, in some of the interviews that he did after going to the north, he mentioned a land beyond the poles. And that the only way you can get beyond the North Pole would be to somehow enter into the interior of the Earth, and that if there is land dispersed on the interior of the Earth, and if the Earth is indeed hollow, as is specified in some of the ancient rabbinical commentaries, as well as many of the different stories that speak of this North Pole hope opening. Now, how big it is, I have no idea. Supposedly, Byrd flew into it. Whether that's true or not, I have no clue. But it is supposed to be sizable. And so, anyways, continuing. Assuming that the ancient cartographic information was available for the chosen ones in days of old, has anybody tried to search for Hyperborea in the Arctic region? Some of our compatriots participated in the quest for Hyperborea, he says, this particular Russian scientist. The Russian Empress Catherine II got some information of the ancient mythical land near the Arctic Circle via the Freemasons. Catherine II organized 2 expeditions with the help of Michael Lomonosov. She signed a secret decree on May 4th, 1764. The official documents indicated that the expedition headed by Admiral Vasily Shikagov had been dispatched to Spitsbergen to inspect the location for the renewal of whaling and fishing out there. However, the endeavor is referred to as an expedition bound for the North Pole in the memoirs of Shikogov's son. The master was ordered to open an envelope with detailed instructions only after his vessel had made for the open sea. According to instructions, the vessel was to head into the direction of the North Pole. Those instructions were penned by Lomonosov by the by. Unfortunately, the expedition couldn't break through the thick ice and had to turn back. Why was Catherine II so interested in finding Hyperborea? I believe, said the professor, that Catherine, not unlike a few other kings and queens, was enchanted by the prospects of discovering the elixir of eternal youth, which is said to have been invented by the Hyperboreans. Pliny and Herodotus, as well as Virgil and Cicero, reported that people in the land of Hyperborea lived to the age of 1,000 and enjoyed lives of complete happiness. We shouldn't forget that the empress was a woman, he says. Now, what is interesting about this particular article, and its mention of Gerard Mercator, is that for those that don't know who Mercator was or is, he was the individual that was the foremost and most renowned cartographer during the late 1500s, early 1600s, and that he was also had been commissioned by John Dee. Yeah, John Dee of 007 fame. He had been commissioned by him to explore and to report and to create a map which specified and elaborately detailed as to what these ancient explorers and adventurers had encountered in going to the North Pole and other portions of the map of the world. And that he had, when he created his map, he had, at different latitudes, he had scribbled notes upon the parchment which described the things that were said to be and to have been encountered by these various groups in their travels and their expeditions. And I'm going to read a portion of a letter that John Dee received from Gerardus Mercator. He said to him, Jacobus Xenoian of Herzogenbusch, traveling the world like Mandeville, described what he saw with better judgment. He wrote in the Belgic language the ideas about the northern regions which some time ago I extracted from him follow word for word, save where for the sake of brevity or speed I have translated into Latin, when, if not always, his words I have retained his meaning. In North Norway, which is called Dusky Norway, there are 3 months of darkness during which there is no sunlight, but a perpetual twilight. This North Norway lies over against a country called the Province of Darkness, or the Obscure Province. In Latin, Provincia Tenebroso. Concerning it, however, there is nothing written in Marco Polo, and this province of darkness is the most western bound of the Grand Shams land, and between this province and dusky Norway there was only 12 miles of sea. From North Norway you cannot reach the indrawing sea. Now this is interesting, the indrawing sea, and I'm going to elaborate on this here in just a short bit. It's a most fascinating subject. Which lies beyond Grokland. For it lies still further northward. This North Norway stretches as far as the mountain range, which encompasses the North Pole, and borders on this mountain range for about 17 miles by land. The rest is all sea. And this is the same mountain range which comes close within about 15 French miles, and then stands further off toward the east, and near here, towards the north, those little people live, of whom there is also mention in the Gestae Arthuri. Arthuri, that's the mention of King Arthur, which he also made travels, attempted to make travels towards the north during the 4th century. And it is also mentioned, he is also mentioned in great detail within this particular letter, which I'm not going to read the entire thing here. It's very long. It would take me an entire show just to read the one letter, but know that I am printing it in full in my new book, The Paradise on the Sides of the North, The Mouth of the Congregation. And that I'm also publishing in full an account called the Inventio Fortunata, which means the fortunate journey. And that within this journey, it describes many of these ancient explorers and their encounters with the things that they did come across in traveling that far north. Fascinating story, but both of them, and they are confirming witness for the things that I'm citing here, but I'm going to continue. Okay. And this is the same mountain range which comes close 15 French miles and then stands further off towards the east. And near here towards the north, the little people, Gestae Arthuri, their border besides a beautiful open land, and this land lies between the province of darkness and the province of Burjai. But between each of these provinces and these lands lies an indrawing sea. And this province, the open land, has a mountain border of about 72 French miles by land. These facts and more about the geography of the North are to be found in the beginning of the Gestae Arthuri, etc. The islands adjacent to the North Pole were formerly called Scilei, also perhaps Thule, Thule. And now the Septentrionales, among them is North Norway. And there are many small rivers, some 2, some 1, some 3 kennings wide, more or less, and they are called the indrawing seas because the current always flows northward so strongly that no wind can make a ship sail back against it. I've actually got more information now that this indrawing sea, this vortex, this opening, that there is a whirlpool said to be at the very north, and that this whirlpool surrounds this black lodestone magnetic mountain called Rupes Negra, the Black Rock, and that this black rock, this Rupes Negra, is what is reference in Isaiah 14 as the Mount of the Congregation, and that it is also what is called Mount Meru and Mount Olympus, and that there is this opening, this funnel, this wide gaping hole which draws the oceans of the world into the interior of the earth. But unlike what Mercator says, that here where he says, because the current always flows northward so strongly that the wind can make a ship sail back, that no wind can make a ship sail back against it. Actually, it is said to change outward and inward flow every 6 hours, and that this whirlpool reference in the Greek mythology, it's either Scylla or Cerberus. These two whirlpools, or this whirlpool, that in the ancient mythologies, it reverses course. It will, for 6 hours, suck in and draw in a wide gaping mouth, a funnel, which swallows the world's oceans, and then 6 hours later expels in geyser like explosion the waters of the world, flooding and creating the cycle of high and low tide. And so I don't know if Mercator did not know about this here, but he does mention it in another place. But continuing. And here it is, all ice from October to March. And in these latitudes, the mountains reach up to the clouds and are almost all rock bare of vegetation. And that's because this mountain is, as I said, it's a magnetic lodestone mountain. And it does not have vegetation upon it for whatever reason. And it is almost always misty and dull weather, and it is well known that beyond mentioned and yet habitable and inhabited, perhaps I at the time was known, was that there were none there inhabitant. And the North Cape of Norway doth IYE, whatever that is. Maybe it's a conversion mistake, but whereabouts now is good habitation. All right, just a little bit more here. I'm going to skip down just a little bit. I'm going to mention here where it talks about Arthur, and then I'm going to read one more last thing with regard to a description of this area, and then I'll share just a couple other things and end with commentary. When those 4 ships returned, there were sailors who asserted that they knew where the magnetic lands were. Arthur afterwards put on board a fleet of 12 ships, about 1,800 men and about 400 women, and they sailed northwards on May 3rd in the year following that in which the former ships had departed. And of these 12 ships, 5 were driven on the rocks in a storm, but the rest of them made their way between the high rocks on June 3rd in the year 8, which was 44 days after they had set out. All right. Mention of the priest here, it says, the priest who had the astrolabe related to the king of Norway that in AD 1360 there had come to these northern islands an English, the triumphant reign of Edward, 3 Franciscans with some men. a minorite from Oxford who was a good astronomer, etc. Leaving the rest of the party who had come to the islands, he journeyed further through the whole of the north and put into writing all the wonders of those islands and gave the King of England this book, which he called in Latin Inventio Fortunatae, which book began at the last climactic, that is to say latitude 54 degrees, continuing to the pole. This is the book that I had made mention of earlier. It's 14th century. This monk said that the mountain range goes round the north like a wall, save that in 19 places the indrawing channels flow through it, whereof the widest is not above 12 French miles across, the narrowest of a mile, and through the narrowest no ship would be able to go because of the strong rush of the water. The mountain range is surrounded by sea except in North Norway, when the Norwegian mountain range reaches it for a width of about 17 miles. And right under the North Star, remember I told you that, the North Star Polaris, it is located directly above this mountain, the Mount of the Congregation. Right under the North Star, opposite Norway, there lies a fair level sand which is uninhabited, where many beautiful, it doesn't say ... In the east there stretches out an arm of land which is nearly all wooded, and narrows continually the farther north, the more so that it is not more than 1 mile wide where it meets the mountain range. Otherwise, no land touches the circumference of the mountains anywhere, but in many places the sea is so narrow that one can see the far side. All right, I'm going to skip just a little bit. Also, there lay there, said he, an indrawing sea of 5 channels, gathered together, which came through the mountain range of the 19 channels mentioned, and this indrawing sea is 12 French miles wide and measures across about 4 days' journey. Okay, this is the last portion. A whirlpool in the midst, about under the North Pole. The whirlpool is 480 miles wide, excepting the diameter of the Great Rock, which is said to be 33 miles wide in the midst. A wonderful great and high rock which lies right under the North Pole and in the midst of the forest of this whirlpool. And at the west of the aforesaid country is another indrawing sea, into which 3 more channels go out of the aforesaid 19, and that channel which the ships, I believe, are meant had entered also flowed therein, and all these channels which turn tortuously when they come out of the mountains drive ships immediately ashore. But whatever channel flowed straight into the innermost seas into which the 19 channels gather, in these ships must of necessity be carried current-wise inwards and become lost. All right, we'll be right back. We'll finish up. This whole story of what Gerard Mercator talks about as being in the north, and also with what Admiral Byrd is supposed to have seen there, and also with what with different individuals, even Enoch, and I'll actually try to pull that story up here in just a minute, but all of this is very fascinating in that we're not allowed to go to the north or the extreme south. And if this is truly, because we know all the compasses point north, and they say that this mountain, this magnetic mountain uh, that is there at the North Pole, that it is what draws in all the compasses, and the reason why they work is because of this. And so there's some reason why all compasses point north. And according to the ancient explorers, this is the reason why. And so I'm going to just finish reading this one particular portion about this Lodestone Mountain, and then I'm going to finish up with the story of that particular Norwegian fisherman, just a small excerpt of something that he said. But anyways, continuing with Mercator's letter to John D., he says, in the midst of the four countries is a whirlpool, into which there empty these four indrawing seas, which divide the north. Now, I'd like to also say that when you look at the Mercator map of 1577, at the North Pole, there's an image of this black rock, this magnetic mountain, and then it divides it into four quarters, four rivers, just like it's described in the story of Paradise, with the four rivers that merge out from the supposed from the garden land. And it's interesting to me that Paradise is said to be that the North Pole is said to be the location of ancient paradise, and also the cradle of humanity, and even the demigods had once lived there. And so, in my opinion, all these stories are tied together with and connected in the manner that I'm speaking to you about them now, which, as I said, in this new book, which I should be done with in about 2 months' time, I'll have all this information and all these connecting links brought together in presentation, so that you can better understand how these things unify to basically expose truth as is described in the biblical narrative, and also in the mythological accounts and the stories of these ancient explorers and ancient adventurers. All right, continuing. Into which there empty these four indrawing seas, which divide the north, and the water rushes round and descends into the earth, just as if one were pouring in through a filter funnel. It is 4 degrees wide on every side of the pole, that is to say 8 degrees altogether, except that right under the pole there lies a bare rock in the midst of the sea. Its circumference is almost 33 French miles, and it is all of magnetic stone, and is as high as the clouds. So the priest said, who had received the astrolabe from this Minorite in exchange for a testament. And the Minorite himself had heard that one can see all around from the sea, and it is black and glistening, and nothing grows thereon, for there is not so much as a handful of soil on it. That was the writing and the work of the Minorite, who has since journeyed to and fro 5 times for the King of England on business. They are to be found in the book called the Inventio Fortunata. Job chapter 26. But before I read that passage, I'll share one other from Psalms 48, where it describes Mount Zion in the sides in the north. It's one of the only other passages where the sides of the north is mentioned. And Mount Zion, same thing, Mount of the congregation. It says this: Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised is the city of our God in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. And so, again, New Jerusalem is associated to the sides of the north. Mount Zion, the mount of the congregation. All of these are speaking about the same vortex at the north that I'm talking about, Jacob's ladder. It says in Revelation 21, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And so, New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven, again, at this North Pole vortex. All right, continuing. Job says this: Dead things are formed from under the waters, and the inhabitants thereof. Hell is naked before him, and destruction hath no covering. He stretches out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the clouds is not rent under them. He holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth his cloud upon it. He hath compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. And so, in my opinion, Job, in this passage, he connects this opening that leads into hell, that the north is an empty place, that here the earth is open, hangeth upon nothing, and that this is also where he holdeth back the face of his throne, and spreadeth out his cloud upon it. Okay, now I'm going to read the verse from Enoch, which talks about this place as well. Enoch says, I then surveyed the receptacles of all the winds, perceiving that they contributed to adorn the whole creation and to preserve the foundation of the earth. I surveyed the stone which supports the corners of the earth. It also beheld the four winds which bear up the earth and the firmament of heaven. And I beheld the winds occupying the exalted sky, arising in the midst of heaven and of earth, and constituting the pillars of heaven. I saw the winds which turned the sky, which caused the orb of the sun and of all the stars to set, and over the earth I saw the winds which support the clouds. I saw the path of the angels. I perceived at the extremity of the earth the firmament of heaven above it. See, here Enoch is describing at the extremity of the earth the firmament of heaven above it. So he's talking about where the firmament joins in union with the ends of the earth. Then I passed on towards the south, where burnt both by day and night 6 mountains formed of glorious stones, 3 towards the east and 3 towards the south. Those which were towards the east were of very great stone, one of which was of margarite, another of antimony. Those towards the south were of red stone. The middle one reached to heaven, like the throne of God, a throne composed of alabaster, the top of which was of sapphire. I saw too a blazing fire hanging over all the mountains. This that he's talking about, the middle one, that's the Rupes Negra. That's Mount Olympus, Mount Sumeru, Mount of the congregation, Mount Zion. It's all the same thing. All of the prophets, all of the patriarchs, the ancient explorers, they're all talking about the same thing. And so continuing. The middle one reached to heaven like the throne of God. Remember that God sits upon the mount of the congregation, that he has established his throne above the stars and above the clouds. I mean, once you have an understanding of the cosmology, it all ties together. All right. And there I saw a place on the other side of an extended territory where waters were collected. I likewise beheld the terrestrial fountains deep in the fiery columns of heaven. And in the columns of heaven I beheld fires which descended without number, but neither on high nor into the deep. Over these fountains also I perceived a place which had neither the firmament of heaven above it, nor the solid ground underneath it. Neither was there water above it, nor anything on wing, but the spot was desolate. Is this not exactly what Job was describing as a place? Well, let me see what Job said exactly of it. He said, hell is naked before him. Destruction hath no covering. He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. This is exactly what Enoch is describing here. The exact same thing. Over these fountains, as I perceived, a place which had neither the firmament of heaven above it, nor the solid ground underneath it. Neither was there water above it, nor anything on wing, but the spot was desolate. And so this is exactly the same place, and it's tied to what I am talking about with regard to this particular area, this particular region. Enoch saw it. Job saw it. They described it in the best way that they could. Now, I'm going to share one final passage, and then hopefully we'll be able to get to that story of the Norwegian fisherman. This is from the Chronicles of Jeremiah. It says this: 4 winds were created in the world, the winds coming from the east, south, north, and west. From the eastern corner the light of the world goeth forth. From the south the dews of blessing descend upon the world. From the west emanate the stores of snow, hail, cold, and heat, and rains for the benefit of the world. The north corner of the world he created, but did not complete. For he said, whoever declares himself to be God, let him come and finish this corner which I have left, and then shall all know that he is a God. See, the Most High foresaw that Lucifer would rebel and that he would attempt to exalt his seat above the stars and the clouds of God in being like the Most High. It all ties together. It's one big circle. Final part of this passage, it says this: there the demons, earthquakes, evil spirits, and shadim, which are demonic entities, dwell, and from there they come forth to the world, as it is said, out of the north evil shall break forth. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 14. This north place, this is exactly what is talked about in other passages and other places where in Joel chapter 2 it talks about these people being released out of the north country. I'll share with you 2 passages real quick. I'll probably not be able to get to the story of the smoky god, but this is more important anyways because this is scripture. It says this from the vision of Isaiah: lift up a standard on the mountain of the plain, exalt the voice to them, beckon with the hand, open the gates, ye rulers. I give command and I bring them. Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath, rejoicing at the same time and insulting. A voice of many nations on the mountains, even like that of many nations, a voice of kings and nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts has given command to a warlike nation to come from a land afar off, from the utmost foundation of heaven. The Lord and his warriors are coming to destroy all the world. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is near, and destruction from God shall arrive. That's the Brenton translation of the Septuagint. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1 through 6. Remember, I told you that the giants had been locked up in the very center and that the locust army will be released at the end of days? One final portion here. This from the Cave of Treasures and also the Book of the Bee. They both have this passage in it. It says, people ignorant and unacquainted with the power of reason, but who had lived in the world without understanding. And he gathered together and brought them and their wives and children and made them go in and shut them up within the confines of the north. This is the gate of the world on the north, and there is no other entrance or exit from the confines of the world from the east to the north. And so at the end of days, it says right here, now there were 22 kingdoms imprisoned within the northern gate. And at the end of days, these kingdoms will be released. It says, at the end of the world and at the final consummation, when men are eating and drinking and marrying wives, and women are given to husbands, when they are planting vineyards and building buildings, and there is neither wicked man nor adversary, on account of the assured tranquility and certain peace, suddenly the gates of the north shall be opened, and the hosts of the nations that are imprisoned there shall go forth. The whole earth shall tremble before them, and men shall flee and take refuge in the mountains and in caves and in burial places and in clefts of the earth, and they shall die of hunger, and there will be none to bury them by reason of the multitude of afflictions which they will make men suffer. All right, read Joel chapter 2, and it will, it ties together with what I'm talking about here. All these things are tied together. The release of the locust army, how the mount of the congregation is in the sides of the north, that the vortex, the portal into heaven, Jacob's ladder, both leading up to the upper heavens and also down into Sheol, this north polar opening, this whirlpool, this magnetic mountain, all these things are tied together.